Kia ora, my name is Robbie and I'm another white man behind a desk.
And I'm a white woman named Karen, because most white women are. This week we're talking about consent, the perfect topic for comedy. Specifically, we are talking about defining consent in New Zealand law, which we know isn't going to single-handedly stop sexual violence. That would take addressing the culture that causes it, the systems that perpetuate it, and the people out there doing it. We've only got 10 minutes, so leave us alone.
Now, thanks to the Me Too movement, a few sexual predators in powerful positions have had their careers wrecked, and the internet has diverted a small portion of its meme-creating energy toward thinking of new ways to talk about sex and consent.
We've seen people compare consent to taking money out of someone's wallet, giving unconscious people cups of tea, and ordering specialty pizzas. And sure, these metaphors are better than the ones that we came up with.
Consent! It's Digimon. It's not Pokemon. They're different. One came second. It's digital monsters.
They communicate key issues around consent effectively and quickly and for free. But the problem is that they all focus on what consent isn't, rather than what it is. And it turns out that the biggest problem with a lack of a positive definition of consent isn't just figuring out which metaphors will go viral.
Although we have been doing this for 3 years, and a viral video would actually be really nice. So, good job.
It turns out it's also an issue when it comes to legislation, because for some reason, New Zealand legislation has no definition of consent, presumably because our politicians are too awkward to talk about sex.
Instead of a legal definition of what consent is, what we do have is a list of things that consent isn't, which, to be honest, is just not as helpful. It's like you're defusing a bomb and the only information you have is which wires shouldn't be cut. Like, don't cut the green wire.
Which should I cut then?
Don't cut the blue wire either.
Okay, Robbie, that's useful, but there's 20 wires, so
Okay,
should I cut?
Not the blue or the green.
Okay.
Purple.
Yeah, no, I've got it. And then here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Not the purple.
Come on!
Okay, now, I don't understand the law super good, but luckily, not only is Karen a woman, okay, she's also a lawyer.
I mean, I have been admitted to the bar, but I don't currently have a practicing certificate, so I can't legally call myself a lawyer. Section 128, paragraph A of the Crimes Act states that allowing sexual activity does not amount to consent in some circumstances. Like when someone is forced, asleep or unconscious, or too affected by drugs or alcohol to know what's going on. And that is a good start. I mean, those are some really important protections very clearly expressed. And it definitely feels like our legislators are trying to say that giving consent has to be more than just allowing the sex to happen. Unfortunately, they never actually wrote that down.
Which means that when sexual assault cases come up in court, there's no single definition of consent that people can point to. So every lawyer and judge just comes up with their own definition based on their interpretation of case law. Like when you try and use a word you read in a book without ever actually looking it up. Like wan. Wan.
Robbie, it's wan.
Wan.
It's wan.
Wan.
It's wan.
Wan.
It's definitely wan.
Wan.
Okay, there's a widely accepted precedent in New Zealand that true or genuine consent must be full, voluntary, free, and informed, which is definitely a good thing. But what those terms actually mean in practice is up for debate. For example, in the 2015 Supreme Court case, Ah Chong and the Crown, justices agreed mere submission does not constitute consent. Consent requires some positive or affirmative words or conduct.
So that's good. That makes it seem like we're getting nearer to a legal definition that requires affirmative consent, and it seems pretty consistent with how most people act in the lead up to sex. The consent might not be verbal, but it's okay so long as there's affirmative conduct.
On the other hand, there is the case of Scott Kugelheim, who went on trial for sexual violation in 2017. And in that case, Kugelheim's lawyer argued that the woman eventually relented to Kugelheim because she was afraid of coming across as a, quote, bitch or a tease, and that her relenting should count as consent. What's more, in that case, the judge told the jury that, according to his interpretation of the case law, consent given reluctantly is still consent, and Kugelheim was acquitted. It also gave rise to the phrase reluctant consent, which is as internally contradictory as the Australian Liberal Party.
Sexual violence cases can also be widely reported. The Kugelheim case was a prime example because he was a cricketer and sports people are more important than normals. People who had been sexually assaulted would have read or heard the lawyer's argument and the judge's definition, and they'd be right to think that the legal system doesn't always have their back, and that might stop them going to the police.
If you think that something that happened to you was assault, you might want to look up the legal definition. But if you do, you're not going to find that much. And you're almost certainly not going to find the progressive definitions of consent that sometimes get used in court cases. Unless you happen to pay hundreds of dollars a year to subscribe to some obscure legal database.
According to New Zealand Crime and Safety Survey, which is the best estimate we've got, only 7 to 9% of sexual assaults actually get reported to the police. And of the reported sexual assaults, only about 13% actually result in conviction. Now, that happens for a lot of reasons, but it makes sense that the legal system's inconsistent definition of consent would make people more reluctant to report sex crimes. Even if you were starving, you might not want to eat a chicken if I told you there's a 13% chance that it's cooked.
Which is why a legislative definition of consent, handed down from on high, could be helpful. A Crimes Act definition could legislate terms like reluctant consent out of the courtroom. And the legislation already implies that consent should be something more than passive submission. And we know that that principle is already being applied in the courts sometimes. But sometimes is not good enough.
A positive definition isn't about making sex some unwieldy beast that's impossible to do without signing a legal document and having all of your blowjobs witnessed by your mum's best friend who's a justice of the peace now. It's about codifying in law the stuff we already know about consent. That it should be affirmative, conscious, and voluntary.
Obviously, it is just a small thing that our legislators could do to help, but that does not mean that they shouldn't do it.
Our MPs agreeing on a definition of consent would be a really good next step.
Yeah. Hey, MPs, we know it is awkward talking about sex, but we know that you like it. I'm looking at you, Shane Jones, with your private film choices and your 7 kids.
If our politicians could talk about consent as well as we can, then our legal system might be consistent.
Get over it, MPs.
We know you fuck. Okay, normally just walk off at the end.
Okay.
So if you want to, I don't
Should
know
I just
why.
go around?
If you,
This
sorry.
one here. Oh, just
yeah,
under the mic?
Under the berm.
Oh,
That's okay.
yeah,
I'm just
sure.
trying to get. You good?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Good.
Ooh,
Oh,
tight.
yeah. It's not a lot of room.
Okay.
I haven't improved the budget.